So welcome tonight to the Mike Center sponsored book talk by Professor Chris Robé, Abolishing Surveillance, Digital Media Activism, and State Repression. So I'm Todd Wolfson. I'm a professor of media studies at Rutgers, and I'm co-director of the Mike Center, along with Victor Picard and Sarah Jackson, who's not here with us, who both here at Annenberg. And for you all, Mike Center stands for Media, Inequality, and Change, and it's a collaboration between Annenberg and Rutgers, the Rutgers School of Communication and Information. And Mike's core principles are to research, educate, connect, and engage. And we accomplish this by assessing social movement strategies and democratic deployments of technology, contributing to policy interventions that encourage structural reform, committing to long-term field building in political economy, media, policy and technology studies, and other cognate areas, assisting social justice campaigns and making material interventions around media and democracy. And we're lucky. Tonight we're going to get to hear from Chris on his new book, and we'll get to hear. So the way the night will play out, Chris will talk for about 25 minutes about his wonderful book, and then Mike's postdoctoral researcher, Malav Kanuga, will come up on stage and he'll introduce our amazing panelists who are over here, who will all respond to Chris, and then we'll get into a fantastic Q&A. But before doing that, I want to just give Chris a little intro. I have the joy of having known Chris since we first met. I think we first met at the U.S. Social Forum in Detroit in 2010, right? So at the U.S. Social Forum in Detroit, and since then we've been conspiring or scheming around media, social movements, and labor. But more formally, Chris is a professor of film and media studies in the School of Communication and Multimedia Studies at Florida Atlantic University. He primarily writes about how various communities and social movements employ media making in their activism. And he's written several books, including Left of Hollywood, Cinema, Modernism and the Emergence of U.S. Radical Film Culture, and Breaking the Spell, A History of Anarchist Filmmakers, Videotape Guerrillas, and Digital Ninjas. More recently, he co-edited the collection Insurgent Media from the Front, a media activism reader. And one of the places we like to talk is he's long been a leader of the faculty union at FAU, which is part of the United Faculty of Florida. So we're so lucky to have Chris. Chris, come on up and give us a talk. Where's my toast?
Thank you all. I'm going to put my timer on here. So I just keep time. Thank you all. Thank the Mike Center. That's Todd. Thank Victor, Malav, Breyer, who's working by the scenes, Zach. Where are you? Zach? Thank you so much. Anybody else, the panelists, thank you so much for participating in this. So the way I was thinking of just sort of outlining some of the major premises of the book and my work in general and laying that out, and during the Q&A we can kind of get more into depth about that itself. In regards to the newest book, Abolishing Surveillance, there's 4 different chapters to it. And I wanted to associate together 4 different movements that aren't often thought in conjunction with one another. So the first chapter is animal rights activists, and particularly people who go undercover at factory farms and out, as well as challenge the lawyers who are challenging these things called ag-gag laws that make it illegal to actually film on the factory farms, to film the cruelties that are going on there. The second chapter is about counter-summit protesting. It takes place in 2008 in Minneapolis during the RNC at that time, and how many video activists and activists themselves were preemptively arrested before they did anything itself, and were laid down with, this group called the RNC-8 was laid down with domestic terrorism charges, which we can think about now in relationship to Stop Cop City going on, and the 5 activists who have also been charged with that itself. The third chapter is about cop watching and community organizing, mostly taking place in New York City. I had the pleasure of being out there earlier and talking to some of the people who I worked with itself, and really making an argument that cop watching has to be understood in relationship to community organizing, not just a sole entity unto itself, and has a long history before that. And then finally, I returned to Minneapolis again, working with Muslim American youth, and particularly Somali American youth, which is the highest population in the United States, fighting Islamophobia there, and particularly various programs like countering violent extremism that was developed under the Bush administration, but really implemented under Obama itself. And so the value, I was hoping the book, this might be ambitious, one, It's for the activists themselves, hopefully to read, as well as obviously educators, but hopefully by reading about themselves, they might read about other people, right, that I interviewed, and I try to hook them up behind the scenes with each other when I see sort of relational things. So just an obvious thing, I think it's really important of like tying together in many ways animal rights and speciesism to sort of the racism and settler colonialism we see going on in the other chapters itself. In many ways, factory farming, the very people who are doing undocumented people, right, black and brown folk, who are doing the factory farming and held vulnerable, in many ways are equated with animalistic tendencies that in many ways speciesism does. Okay, a couple other things. This is general, a lot of media studies scholars have kind of picked up on this, but understanding digital media as a site of essential struggle itself. Not something that's just about representing issues, which I think is important, right, the representational thing, but also in terms of using it as a form of activist practice itself, right? So the production, distribution, exhibition, all of this can feed into organizing people with that itself. I think of the work I did here, actually, in Philly with the cab drivers who were forming a union in the early 2000s. And I remember particularly Ron Blount, right, who was a part of it. He made a really lasting impression. I did an interview with him early 2000s, and really kind of shook me up in terms of understanding the struggle itself from kind of, quite honestly, a privileged position. So I remember him telling me during the interview, saying, I would have probably not talked to you a year ago with this, and I asked him why. He's like, well, one, I was worried about my boss hearing anything that you might have recorded from me, and any kind of retaliation. Two, since you're a professor and I'm a cab driver, there's a sense of hierarchy there. I might not have felt comfortable with it, but it was the third thing really that hit me. He goes, honestly, he's like, a year ago, I individually and us collectively didn't know what we wanted to say, right? There was not sense of an articulation of the voice. It was only when we started organizing, not only as cab workers, but for a radio station that they were doing, as well as a video, getting together in that room together was really the most profound thing that the cab drivers related to me, right? Of not seeing each other as the enemy and competing for fares and stuff itself, right? A real cutthroat business, but actually sharing a sense of oppression and mobilization was really that. So it reminded me the importance of just remembering how many communities, right, are disenfranchised from their voice in a sense of collective activism itself. And I bring that to everything I do and try to remind myself of that, of what's going on. In many ways, what I'm saying, I should say too, just to, most activists and media activists know this, right? They think of video as activist practice itself. It's sort of scholars who have been disconnected from this itself. So I think of Greg Bordowitz, who was a really great video activist during ACT UP. During the late 80s and 90s, he would always say, I think of media activism as a verb, not a noun, not something to be studied, but something actually that we do itself. The second thing that the book really emphasized, but I think a lot of my work does, is the importance of the local. Often in media studies and communication studies, there's this desire to see what goes viral, right? What goes global. And I think that's a really important thing to do. I'm not taking away from that at all, particularly if we're thinking about videos that are circulating about black and brown people being killed. What effect does that have of re-traumatizing people who see it? What effect is that in terms of actually mobilizing? Is it mobilizing people, or is it just sort of playing into the spectacle of death and so on and so forth? So I'm not taking away from any scholars who do that. But at the same time, I think there's really important stuff to be done in terms of the local and discrete practices going on. And listen, on one reason a lot of scholars don't do this type of work, it takes a lot of resources to do it itself. You have to have time off, you have to have money, you have to build trust with communities that you want to work with, right? No one should trust us, right? In some ways, when we're coming from the outside, you have to be really humble and understand anybody who gives you an interview or their time could have been doing something else, right, at that time itself. So it's sort of an honor in many ways when they do it to you, no matter what you might think about their politics or whatever itself. So you have to be aware of that. I also think of this comm scholar who studies, Kevin Howley, who makes a really good argument about the importance of how the global and the local interconnect. And I'm not reading much from this, but he has a good quote where he talks about a focus on local community provides an exceptional vehicle to examine the processes of globalization from the perspective of local communities, right? The ways in which global forces are actually converging on these localities and spots itself. And for me in particular, by focusing on the local, you start seeing the parts where the on-the-ground activism and digital activism converge and conflict, right, in sort of interesting ways. There's also a fetishization, particularly in my home discipline of film media studies, to just focus on the screen and not what's outside of that. And I would argue actually, most is going on off the screen, not on it itself. So it behooves us to actually study practices and stuff. And sort of the last thing often thought of is what's going on there. So I wanted to provide a brief example from the book about this. This is the only kind of concrete example I'm going to give of the various stuff. But when I went to Minneapolis, and I was focusing on Somali American youth, fighting Countering Violent Extremism, which was a program instituted by the government. Under Obama, there were 3 target cities that were focused on: Boston, LA, and Minneapolis, for all, problematic reasons. This idea is nothing new, just like the resistances are long, and I'll get into that in a bit. So is the repression, right? So these ideas come from England, and they're focusing on Muslim American communities and making them suspect, and you could even argue it goes back to the 1970s of England's making Northern Ireland a suspect community itself. Those practices are inherited from a long tradition of colonialism and imperialism itself. So when I was there, talking with people, I roughly did work in Minneapolis from 2016 to 2019, 2020, right before the pandemic happened. There was a really vibrant grassroots campaign on the ground of local youth focusing on what countering violent extremism is and holding all these anti-CVE rallies going on, taking over local spaces. It's a place called the Brian Coyle Center, which is a huge community center just behind the Riverside Towers, which has about 8,000 people of the community, low income, so on and so forth. So really explaining what the problems were. CVE, I should just say, and Arun might want to talk about it more later. In many ways, it was supported by the Department of Homeland Security and would offer money to local NGOs and organizations. It would be a pittance of money that they offer them, but the contingent thing was you had to report back on who you thought was suspicious operating within these communities itself. So it took advantage of disadvantaged communities, and particularly nonprofits who didn't have any money itself. And in many ways, it tore the communities apart, because the organizations that didn't take the money in many ways would accuse the organizations that were taking it playing into the Department of Homeland Security itself, even though in their minds they weren't, right? They were just desperate for money itself. So it was a really problematic thing, and basically makes everybody kind of a suspect community. And if you study any of this stuff, the indicators that they claim for suspect communities are like anything we could have, right? Like if you're dealing with teenagers, right? Somebody who's shifty, somebody who doesn't want to talk to you, right? Like, right, it's just laid on that. So while that's going on in a really successful way, HBO comes to town and wants to do a series there called Mogadishu, Minnesota, right? It's actually organized by Kanan, right, the Somali Canadian rapper, who actually had credence, right, locally in Minneapolis originally, but it's the way in which the series was sort of employed upon Minneapolis, or wanted to be, that was problematic. And just a couple things I'll outline here of what people had problems with. One, there was a subplot of terrorism, right? So people were tired of that, of yet again, Muslim American group kind of being considered terrorists itself. There were also sort of stereotypes of gangsters, right, within the show. I should say, I know all this because they smuggled a script to me. We weren't supposed to see it, but activists actually made a photo, like copies of the script through their film, and I found a mysterious thumb drive in my mailbox when I was staying out there. No, I still don't know who I got it from. And I got to see the entire script itself, which I'm sure HBO is happy that I reveal some of it in the book. Catherine Bigelow, the producer who did Hurt Locker and Zero Dark 30, was a producer of it. And in their minds, right, is a very reactionary type of filmmaker in terms of, supporting American empire, so on and so forth. Although she honestly really didn't have much to do with it, they promoted her a lot. And that fucked up HBO, right, in the ways in which these local Muslim American youth were doing a political economy analysis. Like, if Catherine Bigelow is involved in this, well, what do we think is going to be happening with this thing itself? And then finally was the processes of HBO, just sort of ripping into town, doing this runaway production, claiming that they're getting community involvement, but it's very minimal itself. And I do a good contrast with a really great film that never got distributed called Astray by Musa Saeed, who's up in Harvard right now as an instructor, but he worked with the community for over a year to actually get involvement with the script, get local actors, so on and so forth. So I provide this sort of comparison contrast. Anyway, the local youth, some of them do this hashtag, say no to HBO campaign, and they start posting it on YouTube and various Somali message boards. It's very big in the Somali community and just Somali communities in general to have these message boards, SomaliNet, and I forget the other one, Somali World, I think it's called. But as this message against the series started going out, it had this effect of context collapse that Henry Jenkins calls, of that it loses specificity from where it comes and sort of gets abstracted outward. So it's hard to maintain. So like all these misinterpretations started happening, or just even conflicts. Like some people are like, well, what's wrong with Kanon doing this thing, right? He was trying to do a thing and you guys are just being oppositional. There was this sort of reading in of like, this is a fight between various tribes, Somali tribes, right, which there are 4. So this is wrong and not true at all, but like that the activists themselves were from one tribe and Kanon was from another itself. And YouTube, this is 2016 when this is happening. Trump, you might remember, right, had his sort of acolytes on there, berating local Somali Americans and what was going on there itself. So on that level, it looked like a very failed campaign in terms of what was going on. Yet behind the scenes, right, you have this whole thing going on grassroots-wise against anti-CV. So I thought that was a good example of like, if you were just looking at the screen, this looks like a failed attempt in some ways. HBO ultimately didn't make the show, I should say, but it only did the first season, but it's debatable if it really was the activism that did that or all these other factors, that the film tax credit program, the rebate program they were going to do was uncertain. It wasn't long enough. There were all like other factors that fed in. I'm sure the activism helped, but I thought it was a good reminder in terms of what was going on. One other thing to even mention in terms of the anti-CV campaign that would bring in filmmakers of it. So particularly, I remember I went to a screening of The Feeling of Being Watched by Asiya Bundawi, who does this great film about the surveillance of her own neighborhood in Chicago, and she came to this thing itself. So how they set it up, they did a screening, she came in, they had people in the audience, which had about 300 people within there, write questions on these pieces of paper on the wall, what they want to do, and then addressed it, right, as a press, and then they started mobilizing afterwards itself. So that was a really good example. Final thing I want to emphasize here, and I think I'm I'm a historian by nature, so I think it's really important, and Jack has spoken about stuff like this before too, at least between ourselves, of like understanding the longer historical purview of these struggles, right? They don't just suddenly come out of nowhere or spontaneously itself, but there's like a lot of precursors in terms of what goes on. And I think our job as scholars, and at least one of my main ways of inputting myself, is like tracing those designs and what's going on in terms of the past and the present. So this book and the book prior, Breaking the Spell, really tries to outline some of the ways in which this stuff's going on. In many ways, when you don't see things going on, that's when the real activism is happening and people are reconstituting themselves, right, to form up into something longer itself. So just a couple things I wanted to highlight in terms of the book. The cop watching chapter that I focus on, and I focus on 2 groups particularly, El Grito de Sunset Park out of Brooklyn, another group called Cop Watch Patrol Unit, but I'll focus just on here briefly El Grito de Sunset Park. They start getting visibility around like 2013, 2014, 2015. And in some ways, what happened at the time when BLM was really starting to take off is this idea that all of a sudden all these new cop watching groups like started forming, and many did. I mean, you don't want to deny the impact of BLM, right? It was very significant itself. At the same time, what it did, it was sort of help propel already existing sort of cop watching groups itself. So the book sort of, and BLM is obviously different across the country, so some places it's more strong than others, and some places it's considered more appropriated than others. Everybody I talked to in Minneapolis, at least the group of activists I was, speaking with, I spoke about 30 different intergenerations. They didn't really like BLM up there. They considered it part of the Democratic Party and sort of appropriated by them, kind of against their arguments about CVE. So we should keep that in mind. I'm always trying to propose to graduate students, by the way, of like doing sort of like case studies of BLM in various localities. And I think it would be really interesting of doing that, right, and seeing how they formed and like what sort of impacts they had itself. Nonetheless, so El Grito de Sunset Park has an interesting backstory that I learned through them. And in many ways, all the work that I do would not be possible without the activists themselves, right? Telling me the stories, giving me their time, referring me to things itself. So Dennis Flores, who's one of the founders of it, a Puerto Rican background, mentions to me, like, really, we wouldn't have been possible had the Young Lords not happened here in New York City, right? Just as a refresher, right? The Young Lords start in Chicago originally in 1967. They form a chapter in 1969 that's very strong and, roughly last until 73, 74, 75. They're modeled off the Panthers, the Black Panthers, right, a self-determination type of movement. And similarly, right, are not just simply about holding the police accountable, as the Panthers were, but also instituting the services of local communities that the state has pulled back resources out of, right? That's a really important thing to keep in mind for the Panthers and understanding young lawyers and all these self-determination type of groups, that they are supplying the very things that the state is trying to pull back that allows for gentrification to take place itself. So they take over a church, right, at that time, twice over in New York City, in many ways, it's a direct action model that they have, right? So in other words, they take over the church to show the church what it should be doing for the community, not waiting and talking to, right, the people in the church itself to do it, but doing it themselves. They take an ambulance, right, in New York City and start inoculating people with it itself, not waiting for hospitals to respond. They start removing garbage from streets, right, in some ways when trash people aren't doing it itself. Anyway, the Lords start breaking up around the mid-70s for various reasons, and there's particularly two people that are influential to this story, Richie Perez and Vicente Panama Alba, right? These two guys, they start mobilizing in different ways, but by the late 80s and early 90s, they start talking to Puerto Rican youth who are involved in gangs, right, at the time. And I should be clear here when I'm using the term gangs. I don't mean like roving bands of like maniacs going out to threaten people. Gangs start in many ways as self-defense, right, in neighborhoods, and are often misinterpreted. It's a self-protective thing often that people form into gangs that are totally misinterpreted. Anyway, these two guys were going around New York City and talking to a bunch of youth, and lo and behold, Dennis Flores was one of them. And they mentioned, like, you should be turning your energy away from each other, right, in many ways, and in more sort of positive directions, and also critiquing the police, like in terms of police brutality itself. Marley Graham happened at that time, roughly, itself, and Amadou Diallo also were two, like, really high-profile killings occurring in the 90s itself. So, in many ways, that provided the impetus for El Grito de Sunset Park that actually then just started concretely out of the Puerto Rican Day Parade that was in Brooklyn at the time, not the New York one, but the police would congregate around during Puerto Rican Day Parade and arrest people, right? And rightfully so. Dennis and others were like, well, you don't do this during St. Patty's Day Parade, right? You have thousands of drunken Irish people or people who claim want to be Irish up here and do nothing itself. So there was immediacy with that. And out of that grew sort of their community organizing too. Then they started learning about issues going on within, in Sunset Park itself. And they organized helped like people go on rent strike at the time, allying themselves with OWS and so on and so forth. So that's one good example of, right, that they reconstituted as El Grito de Sunset Park and extended from that time itself. I could go into more during the Q&A. Just one other thing I want to highlight too is a group that's in the book as well called Unicorn Riot, that I'm sure you all know of, like for various things, right? They did awesome coverage in terms of the Charlottesville Nazi rally, basically. They recovered the Discord channels going on among neo-Nazis behind and out of it, and they took it seriously, so they were the only people really down there covering that when Charlottesville was occurring in, I believe, 2017. I talked to a bunch of people in Charlottesville that really do credit Unicorn Riot as doing the best coverage of that time. They became more, they also were releasing ICE manuals in terms of like these, right, what the government's doing to repress us. And more recently, you might remember them from covering the George Floyd protest as well as the trials. As well as awesome stuff where they had these sort of, they covered, although they're an anarchist organization, they would often just, not infiltrate even, but just sort of do live streaming of sort of conservative events. So when it was sort of the anti-lockdown struggles going on in Michigan and Minneapolis, they covered it in really phenomenal ways of just letting people speak for themselves and getting a sense of the texture of what was going on with the moods. Anyway, in terms of Unicorn Riot, officially they came on the scene in 2015 during the Ferguson protest, and sort of the narrative often told about this is like they were trying to upload videos on YouTube and other things, but they weren't, these sites weren't allowing them to write the coverage of what the protests going on in Ferguson, so they ultimately kind of create their own website at that time, which is pretty snazzy, right? Like it's a good mixture of text, but also short video, and then you can also link to like longer form stuff itself. But one thing to keep in mind with the Unicorn Riot, they actually have origins much earlier than that itself, before they constituted. One group of them came from actually the other chapter I mentioned, the RNC-8. They were older and they witnessed the repression against video activism during the 2008 Republican National Convention, and that politicized them in many ways to get involved in media activism, and some of them were involved in Twin Cities indie media at that time as well. Again, I'll just footnote here, indie media, right, forms in 1999, and it's a really transformational, Todd and I have written about this, right, and he's written it more in depth than I have, but, a really transformational movement, an aspirational movement in terms of what was going on, of everyday people sort of becoming the media themselves. So half of the group of Unicorn Riot was that. The other half started out of Global Village out of New York City that was doing live streaming during OWS, Occupy Wall Street. So it's through those longer things, right, 2011 and 2008, that reconstitutes as Unicorn Riot itself during that time. So, just in general, I'll wrap up here, I'm not here to idealize activism, and although I'm speaking about video right now, I think media activism takes all forms, right? We should keep that aware of that, and depends on context specificity of what activism is most relevant. So when I write about it, I'm talking about, anywhere from print activism, theater, radio, so on and so forth that it might be. At the same time, without idealizing it, right? I'm trying to identify and show the conditions that allow certain forms of activism to take place and foreclose other forms of activism. And I think, the local in particular, again, just returning back to that, is a particular, really great locale to look at, to see, right, of the various practices that allow for these things to emerge and don't itself. All right, I look forward to hearing from you all. Thank you so much for coming, and look forward to tonight.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris. I'm not sure how hot this mic is, but can you all hear me okay? All right, well, thank you. As Todd mentioned, my name is Malav Kanuga. I'm a postdoc researcher here at the Media Inequality and Change Center, and really delighted to have an opportunity to also to hear from Chris and hear his latest work on media activism and state surveillance and state repression. Chris opens up the book with the essay adage from Joan Didion, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." And Chris's scholarship in the book and throughout so much of his work also reminds us that movements make media in order to move, to learn, to connect, and to build power, and also to change narrative. Those are really essential cornerstones of the work that we're doing at the Mike Center. And I think a really important reminder also that we do need to tell ourselves our own sort of media activist histories and use those to make sense of a kind of larger context and world we're in. And in that regard, it's, I think, really important that we can focus our attention on the question of growing state and corporate power, predictive and repressive power. The question of surveillance looms quite large in many ways every day, but also in ways that I think have profound political implications for not just our question of social justice, but very sense of humanity and what we do to make sense of where we are and where we're headed. So, of course, those are large, very, very big questions, but we have a really fantastic panel that's going to help us unpack some of these things. So it's my honor to be able to introduce that panel and keep the program moving. I'll introduce the panel in the order that they appear to you. I assume you've settled your quarrels about who's going first, second, and third. What I do know is that in good dialectical fashion, we'll hear some negativity, some positivity, and then some synthesis of the three. But and so we'll hear for about 10 minutes or so from each panelist, and then we'll give Chris a chance to respond as well. And then we'll open things up to question and discussion, rumination, and aspiration. So at the far left of you all is Arun Kundnani, who's a writer based here in Philadelphia. His most recent book is What is Anti-Racism and Why It Means Anti-Capitalism? But there are several others. The Muslims Are Coming, as well as The End of Tolerance. Born in London, Arun moved to the US in 2010, more recently to Philadelphia. The Guardian has described him as one of Britain's best political writers, and that's certainly not an exaggeration. So, Next to Arun is Mizue Aizeki, who's the founder and executive director of the Surveillance Resistance Lab. For nearly 20 years, Aizeki has been organizing to end the injustices at the intersection of the criminal and migration control systems, including criminalization, imprisonment, and exile. While at the Immigrant Defense Project, Aizeki has led multiple policy and individual case campaigns to end the entanglement of local law enforcement and ICE policing, and also built community defense programs to combat ICE raids. And then next we've got Jack Bratich, who's a professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University, whose work is situated at the intersection of popular culture and political culture. His work applies social and political theory to such topics as social movements and social media, secrecy, and masculinity. Most relevant for today's panel, he penned Observation in a Surveilled World. Other pieces worth mentioning include Adventures in the Public Secret Sphere, Police Sovereign Networks and Communications Warfare. And Jack's latest book is called On Microfascism, Gender, War, and Death. So, Arun, are you kicking us off?
I am.
Wonderful.
What's up, everyone? It's great to be here to respond to Chris's wonderful book, especially because I think, as he kind of implied, the account in one chapter that he gives of activism in the Somali American community in Minneapolis, and he describes in kind of lavish detail the kind of streets around that community and the cafes and so on, are the exact places that I went to a few years before Chris did to do my own research there. So it's interesting to see us walking the same streets and reaching kind of overlapping but complementary conclusions in some ways about what was going on there at slightly different times. I was a few years earlier. What I want to do is just quickly kind of engage on like three things that I think are significant for me in terms of bouncing off Chris's work here. And so the first thing is I want us to think about the question of internationalism. Okay, so again, thinking about the surveillance of that Somali American community in Minneapolis, the striking thing that comes out in Chris's work. It is how you have this combination of this very localized story, right, of like how this community relates to these very specific streets and very specific spaces, but then also the diasporic connection to a Somali diaspora that stretches, from Minneapolis to Canada to Scandinavia to Somalia, right, and that through digital media, that community in Minneapolis is very connected to what's happening in Somalia, right, and is deeply engaged on challenging what the US is doing in Somalia, right? That's why it comes to the attention of state surveillance, right? Because it's a nexus of a certain kind of anti-imperialist politics within the United States, right? So you can't understand what's going on in Minneapolis there unless you also understand the footprint of what the US is doing globally, right? In terms of, in this case, in terms of the imperialism of something called the War on Terror, right? When I was doing my research, I spent a little bit of time interviewing FBI agents who are working on counterterrorism within the United States. And, one of the things, there's all kinds of weird things about interviewing FBI agents. I won't go on about too long, but one of the things that struck me was, you get taken inside the field office to this room called a SCIF. Anyone know what a SCIF is? Heard of a SCIF? A SCIF is like the secure room within the field office where there's a kind of special wall to prevent any electronic signals coming in and out. You have to leave your cell phones outside, and like what happens in the SCIF stays in the SCIF, right? And you sit there, and that's where you have your conversation with the FBI agent. But what you notice, and there's banks of computers and big screens like you imagine from the movies, right? But every time I went into one of those places, along one wall, you see a series of clocks for all the different time zones in the United States, and then the last two clocks is Iraq and Afghanistan, right? So you get the mental geography of what counterterrorism looks like for a field office within the United States. It's this seamless global operation that stretches from California to Kabul, right? And 1/3 of the FBI agents who are working there are former US Marines who've been deployed in Somalia, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, etc., and then are brought back to the United States to be deployed in Somali American communities and basically think they're doing the same thing of kind of counterinsurgency and so on, right? This is what you have to understand. And when you think about, you have to think about the integration of state surveillance domestically with state surveillance globally, both in terms of state surveillance and the commercial surveillance networks that are interconnected with those, right? And that happens in all kinds of ways. I mean, think of the Chicago Police Department officer who's basically running a torture operation in the Chicago police station and then gets redeployed to Afghanistan to do the same thing there, right? Think about all the corrections officers in supermax prisons in the United States who then get relocated to Guantanamo and so on, right? These are the circuits that we need to be looking at. So that's the first thing, like to bring in that question of the internationalism, right? And the history of state surveillance in the United States is inseparable from that. Alfred McCoy's work on the origins of state surveillance in the US occupation of the Philippines, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Late 1800s, early 1900s. That's crucial to bring in. Okay, second point. We need to study not only what the state sees, but also what the state fails to see. Okay. So what I mean by this is, in my work, right now, I'm working on a biography of someone called Jamil Al-Amin, formerly known as H. Rap Brown, who was one of the leaders of the Black Power movement, currently in a federal prison. And part of what I'm doing is I'm able to try and piece together a story of what him and his associates were doing, let's say in the late 1960s, early 1970s, in terms of what their political activism looked like. But then I also have something like 100,000 pages of FBI surveillance. So I can see what the FBI thought that they were seeing in trying to surveil him and his associates in that movement, right? The juxtaposition is what's interesting to me, right? So what do you get? What you get is, they know, they record every public statement that he makes. They record everywhere he travels. They record all his bank account information. They have, a good idea of who he's associating with. They know where, they know his kind of family background. All of this stuff is what they're very good at collecting, right? What they get completely wrong is what the movement is really about, right? Because they're convinced that this movement coming out of the Black freedom struggle is essentially a communist. The black people in this movement have been manipulated into their activism by kind of communist puppet masters in Moscow or Beijing, right? It's a complete misreading of what this movement's about, and that there's a kind of structural ignorance in the surveillance that you keep coming up against, right? So there's a kind of way in which distortions are inherent to the state's gaze here, right? And this is what I want to kind of have us focus on a little. So. And this is important because we have a tendency, I think, when we think about surveillance, both in activist settings and in academic settings, to kind of think that the state sees everything, right, and knows everything. We kind of give the state a kind of omniscience, right? The state isn't a god, right? It's not omniscient. It has a kind of structural ignorance because it's motivated by racism, by all kinds of displacements and denials and so on, right? And what's more, of course, it's politically self-defeating for us to think of the state as omniscient, because then, well, why do we bother doing and that's the story what we often tell ourselves now is like, the Black Panther Party heroically take on the system, but of course they were squashed by COINTELPRO, and there was nothing they could do about it. The state knew exactly what they were doing, and they squashed them. And we tell that story all the time, right? That's not actually what happened. And it's also a very disempowering story, because then, what can we do? Give up, right? One good source to think about this stuff is a book that, I don't know if anyone reads this book anymore, especially on questions of surveillance, but Victor Serge's 1926 book, Corridors of the Security Police. And now what he's doing in that book is, he's part of the revolutionary movement in Russia that leads to the 1917 revolution. In this book, after 1917, he goes into the files of the Tsarist secret police, and he's like, let me sit down and analyze what they were up to, what did they manage to do, right? And what were its effects. So what you get is, they had all the things that the FBI has nowadays, right? The secret police in Tsarist Russia had 35,000 informants across Russia. They had, agents provocateurs to kind of enable the criminalization of participants in movements. They had a filing system, a paper filing system in which, each person they were spying on had a card, and then that would be cross-referenced with all their associates and so on, just like what we would now call kind of social network analysis, like a tool that the FBI uses, right? And so they had all that, right? And Serge speaks about a very high level of accuracy about individuals and organizations that they were able to get through that. They could see everything, he says, but nevertheless, they were powerless to prevent what happened, right? This is his point, right? So he says, it would in fact be wrong to let oneself be taken in by the apparently perfect mechanism of Tsarist security, right? They watch, but they don't know that they're watching their own demise, right? That's what's going on. That's the story he's telling, right? And that seems to me important, that sense that the kind of knowledge they get doesn't actually help them as much as you might think to prevent the kind of revolutionary politics that these movements are involved in, right? This brings us to my third point, which is, a great virtue of Chris's book is that not only does he examine the actions of the state, but also, of course, how movements are resisting state surveillance and repression, right? And here, we really do need to, I think, pursue this and do much better job of engaging with the deep and intricate knowledge of surveillance that exists in communities in struggle, right? So, again, in my work on the biography of Jamil al-Amin, in which surveillance is a big part of his story, there's this moment in my research where I was interviewing his wife, who's been with him since 1967, and there was a period in 1970, 1971, when, as he was then, Rat Brown was on the FBI's most wanted list, and he was in hiding. But his wife was not. She was living at their regular address and so on. And so obviously she got a lot of attention from the FBI because they were assuming that they could find him by surveilling her. And so I was talking to her about what that was like in that period, and she said, at that time, the apartment that she lived in Harlem, she had an arrangement with the janitor who worked there where he would signal, like when he called up to her apartment when there was someone coming into the building, he would use different kind of number of rings to tell her whether it was a regular guest or whether it was someone who looked like they were fed. So they had this kind of operation. She had figured out how she was always getting followed in her car. She figured out how she could lose a tail. She figured out that she could, at one point, she wanted to visit her husband who was in Tanzania, and she figured out how by buying 3 different tickets and having friends of hers fly on different flights in a certain way, using her name, which you could do in those days, and can't do it now, she could actually leave the country without the CIA tracking her, right? And managed to get to Tanzania and see her husband without the CIA thereby locating her husband, right? I have all the CIA files as well, and it's clear they had no idea where he was. That was really striking to me. Every time she's, noticing an FBI agent in her building or anything like that, she's writing it down, description, she's building up her own file of the FBI, right? She's surveilling the FBI. So my question obviously was, well, how on earth, this is spycraft stuff. This seems like sort of something out of a James Bond film. Like, how on earth did you know how to do all this stuff, right? And her answer was, well, we've been doing this stuff in my family for centuries, right? Like, and you ask her what she means, and turns out her ancestors, going back to the Dred Scott case in the 1850s, her ancestors had to flee from the Klan and escape to Canada, so they knew how to operate underground, how to do things out of view, right? And that's been passed down. Her mum had been surveilled by the FBI because her mum was involved in teacher activism in Harlem in the 1950s, right? So there is these kind of histories of a sense of knowledge right here of how you deal with surveillance, how you live with surveillance, and you don't exaggerate its power, and you have the confidence and skills to be able to navigate and carry out your movement work in spite of the fact that you're under surveillance, right? That seemed to me the really powerful point here that we could do more of. And the significant thing is it's not being presented as a set of technical skills that you can go to some kind of workshop to learn, right? Learn from specialists in the technicalities of surveillance. This is storytelling over the kitchen table, right? In people's homes and in communities. So in a conflict between a movement and the state, part of that conflict is to do with who knows more about the operations of the other, right? They're surveilling the movement, but the movement is also surveilling them. And this is, again, a theme that runs through Chris's book, right? I mean, cop watching is nothing but us doing surveillance of them, right? Undercover in a factory farm, well, the word undercover tells you that, right? It's surveillance, right? So that's one part of it. But the other part of thinking about surveillance, apart from this kind of battle over knowledge, is, and again, Chris writes about this really well, that what he says is that the paranoia, the infusing of paranoia into the scene to sow distrust, right? And this is this particular problem of when you're dealing with informants, right? Of, what's so pernicious about the deployment of informants is you no longer know whether you can trust the people that you're working with in a movement, right? And so, as he says, it's psychological warfare. And here, the conflict is not so much about knowledge, it's about a movement's capacity to build community, loyalty, and love, and on the other hand, the capacity of surveillance to break us down into fearful, isolated individuals, right? Each of us only relating to the other through the kind of gaze of the state and market surveillance. And as Chris writes, social movements, their collective will and solidarity against neoliberalism's atomistic practices is what movements ultimately are about asserting, right? And so the point is, a study of surveillance that just catalogues what state systems can do to us is not going to be sufficient. We need to, because if we do that only, we're going to just reinforce this kind of image of the state as omniscient. We need to kind of not do the state's work for it, right? We need to create a way of engaging with those histories of people navigating surveillance, the knowledge that is in communities, and finding ways to recirculate those and celebrate those. The knowledge that tells us the stories of that kind of community struggle and survival. And what that tells us is that the opposite of surveillance, the antagonism of surveillance, is not some sense of kind of privacy, right? A liberal idea of privacy. It's actually communities in struggle, right? That's the real opposite of surveillance. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for your book and your work, and Arun for your uplifting points. I deal a little bit more in darkness, so I'm just going to say something, I hope complimentary to what others have been saying, but kind of a grounding in what I see as a challenge of our time. And so I really appreciate the highlighting the CVE that you did in your book. So when I think of the Homeland Security state, right, that's what I call the era following the founding of Department of Homeland Security in 2002. I always think of this like a three-legged stool of sorts. So there were people who were regarded as terrorists, right? There are people who were regarded as a threat because they were recent border crossers. And then there was the criminal alien, right, as a main thing. There's other legs to it, but I think that you'll see, like if you look episodically through as DHS grew, this is what animated, right, the growth of the world's largest apparatus to track people, arrest them, incarcerate them, deport them, and exile them. And so I always say this, because I am old in relative to many of you, but I'm not that old, right? So when I was sitting where you guys were in my 20s, there was no DHS, right? There were no ICE police. And if we think about, there was not deportation as a regular part of social control and governance, right? And so what we're just going to grasp a little bit is the scale of what we're confronting now. In the past, since the founding of DHS in 2003, the US has deported, I think, 3 times more people than they did the entire 110 years before that, right? And so this is what I mean when I say national security-driven governance. It's a function of the government now, right? DHS is like the second biggest entity following, I guess, the Pentagon to serve kind of policing militaristic tasks. It has a budget that's grown, right? Billions of dollars. It's grown tremendously. We have a little book Arun and I did here. I got to read the stats here in the back. But, the thing that I think trying to think about it in terms of human costs, right? We're talking about millions and millions and millions of human lives. And I think one thing I just want to say, I also like to talk in 3 points. So really the first point is really grappling with the ascendancy of the Homeland Security state, right? Something that's so absolutely abnormal becomes so normalized, right? And then the role of narrative in that. You're talking about the challenge of a narrative. I want to talk about that a little bit more in a second. But I think this point of, so this idea of governing through threats, but also using surveillance to make people maximally visible to the state, right? So when they founded Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is the interior policing arm of ICE, they had a strategy document called Operation Endgame. And the goal was to deport everybody who could be deported from the United States in 10 years. And what they made really clear was we need to be able to identify everybody. And we can only do that with technology, right? And so we need to recruit the technology to become part of our eyes to see people. They also knew that they had to recruit police, domestic police, because they said, we can't be everywhere, but they are, right? So that was their force multiplier. They also knew that they needed, the legal regime upon which this was already built was already established in 1996, but then obviously after 9/11, they passed even laws that made, government surveillance even more widespread, mass surveillance powers. And I think, just in terms of thinking about surveillance as being pervasive, it's just important to remember, we are all surveilled, but we are not all criminalized and targeted in the same way. And I think the logic of the system rests upon hierarchies of belonging, which are as old as the nation state and before that, right? Who has the right to belong, who doesn't? But you have to think about the role of surveillance then in determining that, right? So now, if you're able to fly in an airplane across the border, some people you have your face, right? An option, they say, it's optional now. Let's take your face in there, right? If you are trying to cross the US-Mexico border, say, without authorization, you're also getting all that stuff done. There are 82 checkpoints throughout Mexico to collect biometrics from people, right? Fingerprints, tracking them everywhere they go. And so I just wanted to make that as kind of my first point, national security-driven governance. It basically squashes other forms of governance, communal governance, democracy, but it also creates very deep regimes of hierarchies of belonging, and then I think an extremely large group of people who have almost no rights. That's one of the things. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the discourse of the narratives that made this possible. And it's really interesting when you see this stuff happen in live time, I always say, right? So when I was in college, 1990s, California had this huge xenophobic moment. Anyone here from California? Okay, you remember Prop 187? Okay, so Prop 187 was a ballot initiative where they would, anyone who was undocumented would not be able to access public services. So this was in the mid-90s, right? Great time, war on crime, war on the poor, kind of this really neoliberalism and punitive governance really flourishing. And California had, it was shifting in demographics. There are all sorts of reasons why an anti-immigrant movement grew there, but it was kind of startling because it passed, right? But the narrative then was, we don't want these welfare leeches, right? It was not terrorism, and it was not criminal aliens, right? And so this was the whole thing. This was the 90s. So then when Bush, 9/11 happens, Bush founds the war on terror, right? What is he talking about all the time? We need to protect our homeland, right, from terrorism. And the way we're going to do that is start wars all over the place, right, form this DHS and start policing all the threats internally in the United States. And so the CVE that you talk about, right, that's like a legacy of the early Bush era targeting of Muslim people. New York City is a very notoriously bad. They rounded up hundreds of thousands of people, right, on the suspicion of terrorism. They didn't find a single person, right, who they could actually convict or charge with terrorism, but they ended up destroying lives, detaining people, and exiling them and doing the most horrible things. And so then you have Obama come into presidency, and it's important just to note how a president who inherits both kind of DHS and the logics, he's trying to pass comprehensive immigration reform, and so he makes a deal, right? He basically says we can have a pathway to citizenship for the good immigrants, but we have to punish the bad immigrants, right? And there's so much to say about this, but I think it's really important to think about if I was to ask you, anybody, who would be a good immigrant, who should have the right to stay, and who shouldn't, right? And how quickly to your mind you might say, well, if that person has a felony conviction, why should they be able to stay here, right? And then I'll tell you, well, that's not your idea. Someone made you think that that's a logical thing, right? And so, when Obama came into presidency, because I live in New York, I started working with people who had been here for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, right? Maybe they spent 1 year, maybe less, in another country and they came here, right? Green card holders, some of them with like US citizen parents, but they never got status. All of a sudden, after doing time, maybe, 30, 20 years later, not 30, 20 years later, ICE would come to their door in the middle of the morning, right? And say, hey, we just need to talk to you and sort some stuff out. Can you come with us? You'll be home for dinner. And then they never came home again, right? And so, I just wanted to say, the things that would happen, the Obama administration would have press conferences and say, oh, we're getting rid of recidivists on the street, right? Every person with a criminal conviction that we deport is never going to commit another crime again. But when you can see this happening and very much then becoming so absorbed by the media as being like the logic of justifying something that is so absurdly cruel, right? That's the second point I wanted to make. And then you have Trump, and then he can take everybody, right? Everybody. Okay, the third thing I just wanted to talk a bit about was the global dimension and where surveillance fits in and biometrics. So when the US invaded Afghanistan, they had this term, the Department of Defense, called identity dominance. And what they basically said is, if we know who you are, you can never hide, right? And what they started to do was go around the streets and collect iris scans, fingerprints, and DNA from every civilian they could find, right? And so that is what ICE was also trying to do in the domestically, right? And so when you guys, anybody willingly gives up anything like that, you got to know it's going into this massive database that ICE has, right? They're calling it the HEART database that they're trying to build. But it contains then the biometrics of people in Afghanistan and Iraq, anyone who's trying to cross the border, anyone who goes on a plane and willingly gives up their biometrics, anyone who applies for citizenship, and then also, refugees. They have a agreement with the UN to collect biometrics in refugee camps. So I think part of what this parade of horribles is just really thinking about a time that gave permission to a government, right, to do the most massive cataloging of people, building on histories of cataloging people. This is not new, but then the role technology and surveillance plays in it. But then also then to not forget this idea of the legal regimes that enable it. And so I just wanted to end on one point before I turn it over to Jack, is, the US government, they've basically, when 9/11 happened, there's a very famous quote in the commission report that says, the American homeland is our planet, right? And I think they used to say the southern border goes down as far as Peru. And so if anybody goes to southern Mexico now, right, you'll see that they've thickened the border. The US-Mexico border isn't, Texas. That's part of it, but it's really southern Mexico. And I think it's interesting how you hear this language around we need safe and orderly migration. We need to regularize migration. They have checkpoints set up from like Panama all the way up through Mexico to surveil people and track them as their movements go along. They call this regularized migration, right? And I spoke to someone the other day who works in this, and they said, it's only a very narrow window of people are eligible for this, but I think out of like 180,000 applications, they might have approved like 100. So I think that when you think about like the regularization and the vast deprivation of rights and how normalized it becomes, and the role of surveillance in it, I think it's really interesting, like you're talking about the local to the global, to think about how it might manifest in a place like Minneapolis, but then also all the global manifestations of it as well. Thanks.
Thanks. All right. I was really happy to read this book. So thanks, Chris. And it's truly timely as stories of police and surveillance start making the news. Not yet. Not yet. Thanks. But I know. That's the closer. That's when we start thinking about what's possible. Yeah, please. Erase your memory. I also want to note that part of the reason sometimes police are in the news is we should acknowledge where we are right now in terms of one example of many of higher ed institutions that are now welcoming and calling in police and all their surveillance mechanisms to come onto students and encampments and protesters. So maybe worth talking about later too. But I'll just mention, we'll talk about the major arcs. I'll mention 4 minor moments that I really liked that were kind of fun. One was the revival of John Fisk as a political analyst. I love that. That was great. So if you don't know John Fisk in the history of cultural studies, this won't land, but he was typically a long abandoned cultural studies scholar, but now, no, it's really great in here. That work is neglected typically in cultural studies, so I appreciate that. Very few people have, I think, talked to, or I haven't thought about what undercover inspectors actually do, what their lives are like when they go into these factory farms and such. So you having access to them really like brought something to life. Like, oh, they leave their families, they have to live in these, and they have to go undercover for months and months and months. Yeah, so that's a really great piece of this that you got access to. I love the first cop watch you traced visually. It was like basically in 1926, a textile strike, a film called The Textile Strike. Brilliant, right? That I didn't even know such a thing existed. So worth thinking about how long people have been filming police brutality and how long police have been trying to stop it, right? In terms of, and that was in Passaic, so nearby. And the last thing was, as a researcher, how involved you got. I was thinking specifically of the one moment where you're recording of with one of your subjects in the cafe when you listen to it, because there were cops also in the cafe. Like, okay, well, some of it was almost unlistenable. Like you heard this high-pitched sound. So you're like, so and your interviewee was like, yeah, it's probably the cops, right? They're jamming your recording. So how invested or how involved you can be in the thing you're studying. Okay, so I too will follow the lead and go with 3 things that I want to talk about. I know, yes, exactly. We started with there was some Hegel, I think, in there somewhere in Mahler's intro. Okay, first it would be around something people already brought about, but it's about domestic terrorism, the quote. And out of three out of the 4 chapters kind of depend on the ability for the state to render certain populations or groups domestic terrorists, right? And I thought that was valuable to know. And I wanted to sort of focus on something you mentioned at the beginning, you kind of end with, which is the right wing, right? You're not able to, it's not part of the scope of the book, but you acknowledge, right, right wing, both uses of digital media at the beginning and also at the end, the expansion of like CVE stuff under the Biden administration to the right wing. And what do we start thinking about that? So I wanted to bring that up to especially in an election time, to remind us about the state that the party system does have different inflections when it comes to the security state, but it's it's important to be reminded of moments where these things are happening across different parties as part of the way we think about, we might want to fight fascism. We do want to fight fascism, but do we want the state to do that for us at times too? So, meaning, okay, so in the 1990s, the other domestic terrorists were like the post-Oklahoma City bombing militias, right? It became really a focal point for the growth of a certain kind of security apparatus. And as we know, under the guise of they were anti-government, right? Or they were extremists. That's where extremism, to me, really began to start unfolding. And now we have that coming back today. So, Clinton was around during the 90s, right? Was the president during a lot of what you're studying in here too, especially with the animal rights activism, Seattle 1989, right? And of course, Obama was presiding over things during Occupy Wall Street and organizing and thinking about police and governors' coordinated efforts to shut that down. I just say university presidents, right, who claim to be also either liberal or to the left, are also willingly to bring cops in, and finally think about mayors, including the mayor here in Philly, who ran on a ticket or a campaign that was as a Democrat to revive stop and frisk here, and obviously Mayor Eric Adams is going through some things right now for his attempt to run New York as just a police state. And this is a moment where we're seeing that, again, some of this campaign, this current presidential electoral campaign, are two sides vying to be the law and order party, right? And so I think this is a moment that we need to reflect on what that is when we have the prosecutor, she's bringing law and order back to the U.S. as a kind of unifying force. Okay, second would be the longer thing, and this is about really expanding, trying to think through the idea of abolition and abolishing surveillance, and thinking about that through what I love in terms of like how you bring in Foucault in this about, carceral logics aren't just prisons. This is about the permeation into everyday life, into social relationships, and we've heard some examples of that already. And so, the ways that the state power operates in a micro level, macro level, as you mentioned in here. Okay, so what would it mean then to abolish what I would think are like a history of certain kinds of U.S. subjectivity that is organized around snitching, observing, reporting. Some of that comes out of its Christian tradition of the kind of like, of surveillance. Some of that gets talked about in like Josh Reeves's book Citizen Spies, the history of recruiting citizens to think of themselves as citizens through their spy work. How deeply that then permeates things like snitch culture. And one of the things that was in the bio that Malav didn't bring up is a piece I wrote called Spies Like Us, which is about the massive pop cultural campaign in the 2000s from A-list Hollywood celebrities in films to TV shows like 24, like other ones, like to spy museums, to cartoons that were really organized around making spy life exciting and making it mundane at the same time. That it actually belongs to Mr. and Mrs. Smith, right? As well as other kinds of agents. So the ways that there's been a wholesale kind of recruitment of subjects that think of themselves primarily as spies and snitches and observers. So what would it be to abolish a subjectivity that depends on and desires surveillance? You mentioned Ring TV in here, and I really like that, because one of the things I'd like to really even maybe, I've seen some research on, but I don't know if I'm going to write it or hopefully somebody else writes it. Stuff on Nextdoor, the app Nextdoor. If you know of Nextdoor, it's an incredible peer-to-peer surveillance mechanism that ties in the Ring TV, but does in the name of the neighborhood of the good neighbor, right? And so, what is that figure of the neighbor now that is also a U.S. subject that depends on surveillance? What forms of solidarity are built on surveillance of another, and one's ever disappearing packages off of their stoops, right? This is the main kind of video circulation that happens on Nextdoor, I would say. Okay, so let's see. So I wonder, and yeah, with not wind, but mention also movements. This is precisely what I was trying to think about. Like, what does it mean to have movements then that have some of that subjectivity built in terms of not just the paid informants. I think we always have to be aware of paid informants and have a good security culture in movements and think about infiltrators, provocateurs, and what happens when something about that logic takes hold that you don't even need to pay informants anymore, or you don't need to pay people to think of these spaces as not even necessarily spaces of surveillance, but of where people who won't necessarily get so tied up in the notion that if there's conflict, if there's a disruption in the movement, that the main thing we have to figure out is if that's a paid informant or not, or if it's an infiltrator. What are other ways of managing conflict, of managing our disruptions without trying to determine which one's real and which one's fake or paid? And I think you talk about it really well in terms of like outreach is the thing that allows this not to happen to begin with. If you have good outreach in communities, then it's not so easy to have others come in and just sort of appear. If you already know kind of, if there's a built set of relationships and trust. And I think the other thing to think about is how movements have been thinking about repair and restoration inside of themselves with ways of thinking about that when it comes to conflict, and Adrienne Marie Brown's work, obviously, and others who are thinking about what it means to have a more reparative model of conflict. So we're not always moving towards paranoia. How do we restore trust? Okay, so let me, in that case, let me go up my last 2 minutes, or a minute, and I'll talk a little bit. The third thing I want to talk about is something I want to bring up because it's local. It's about circulation, it's about media, and it's also about ways of thinking about the possibilities. I'm not sure if this is optimism, but it's possibilities. And I'll say about this that I really like the way you framed the book, Chris, about that so much of this is about counter-revolutionary efforts, right, by the police. So it starts with like, and I think of this also in these ways that movements, the way movements get treated and surveillance gets enacted is through, I think, as counterinsurgency methods and a counterinsurgency approach. So when we think about that, then what does it mean then to think about insurgency? For me, that's like thinking about logistics, thinking about tactics, thinking about strategies, thinking about the streets. Okay, so if we can, yes, please, thanks, Edwin. So here are 2 examples, one from last year, almost exactly a year ago. So I think more about mediation in terms of not necessarily organized groups, but informality. So this was after the release of the exoneration of the cop who killed Eddie Izzard here in Philly about a year ago. There was a good amount of a night or two, I think one night maybe, of one might call looting, one might call property redistribution, one might call expropriation. But one of the things that happened during that time, it's a couple things. One is the image on your left is a liberated piece of Apple technology from the Apple store down here. And what people did, though, is instead of like taking it as commodity, as property, as value, they dumped Gatorade on it because they understood that it's a surveillance tool. And this is when you watch the videos, you're like, yeah, destroy it, right? This is not something that we're just adhering to. So I wanted to mention that. Then what happened is, at the same time, a prominent Philly influencer named Meatball was arrested and charged with at that point 7 felony counts for inciting. She was basically live streaming it, but in an enthusiastic way. I mean, she wasn't like, sort of encouraging people to go, but it was like the excitement of the online personality also in the moment in the streets. And eventually, I just had to look this up. She actually, over the summer, the charges got dropped. I think it's like 5 years probation and like 200 hours of community service. But to think that the cops would want to charge, right, a media maker, right, not a media maker that's even tied to an organization that we know, but right, kind of independent folks who are also tied to the communities, I think is important. Okay, and the next one, and you can start or should I? Okay, all right. So this is just last week. So many of you might know. I'll just start playing these. These are on loop now. These are all 3 perspectives on the same thing. This was a week ago Sunday. In Philly, lately there have been a number of what are called car meetups, where it's like Tokyo Drift. It's like drifting, right? Folks show up with their cars, they speed, they cruise around, and multiple places in the city are doing this. And last weekend on Sunday, there were, I think, like a dozen or 15 of these happening. One of them happened right near the city hall on a market and maybe like a 16th or 15th. So these are images. And what I want to point out is how sometimes when we abolish something, we just might want to render it ineffective and neutral in a joyful way. So as you can see, especially the ways that some folks who have actually who have masked up, and they mask up for a purpose, right? They don't want to be surveilled or wear that alien outfit, and then really stop the car from being able to do its job, right? To protect the community from this police invasion, let's say, of that temporary holding space. And so right now, these kind of images are being circulated by right-wingers to talk about how awful, the Democrats are living in a democratic city is because the cops can't even do their job. But what would it mean for us to start thinking about this as also a place where surveillance can be abolished? And it's not necessarily politicized in the way we want to see it, but it's being done in a community, in a very local way, about a certain way of self-definition around a certain kind of also joy as well. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Is it me? I should, okay. First of all, it's an honor you all reading this. I'm really pleased as punch, as they say. With that, I'll be brief. And just try to tie together a couple things you all said that I thought was really great. Arun, I love you mentioning, what the state fails to see and emphasizing that. I really want to read that biography you're doing. I think that's going to be, I think when a biography is used to sort of intersect historical moments, right, and the way in which it traverses that makes it both very accessible, right, but also very concrete in the way. So I look forward and appreciate what you said, and I just want to emphasize some things out of the book that sort of reinforce what you're saying, because I thought it really was important about that, where it's not just right. We don't want to have this deterministic view. I totally agree, right, as of the state all-encompassing, and you often hear this from many people. It's interesting when you do this work, right? How do you not get depressed? How do you do this and that? And I'm like, actually, I'm optimistic might be pushing it, right? But definitely you are seeing resistance at the micro levels all the time, right? The work that you're doing, Mizue, and so many others that is invisibilized, right? So in some ways, the work I feel is honored to see that, and I feel privileged to relay that to people itself. And just, a couple instances within the book itself. One, that group El Grito de Sunset Park out of Brooklyn. Their cop watching page is really interesting, the YouTube page. So it's not just about what I call the discrete, the little abuses. I actually took this quote from one of the local cop watchers, because he's like, for something like Eric Garner to take place, it's the little abuses that make that possible. The harassing of the churro vendor, right? The harassing of the vendors themselves. Garner was just selling cigarettes, right? And he was doing that many weeks prior to that itself. But also on that page are the celebration of Puerto Rican Latinx culture itself. So you'll see poetry jams, you'll see music, right? You'll see bamba. It's equally important. And you'll see equally amount as hits on those things as the cop watching itself. And I think that's really important. And I spoke to another one of the founders, this guy, Jason, who said, yeah, it's really important to show what's not criminalized, right? Our culture as it is itself as pushing back, what the state fails to see, right? What fails to recognize, which is our normal behavior, right? Which is the richness of our culture itself. And I think that's really important. An interesting thing too, I didn't have time to do it, but in the Minneapolis chapter, the one on Counter Summit protesters, the RNC Welcoming Committee, which is a group that forms a website. And this is a typical tactic. They didn't come up with this, but use the website for people to coordinate actions on there, to facilitate the actions themselves. Nonetheless, they released a video called "We're Getting Ready" to. Anyway, it's an anarchist who's sort of dressed up. It's like a tongue-in-cheek video, right? So there's a person in balaclava dressed up to. I forget what song it is. It's either Joan Jett or whatnot. And so. when the police enact their preemptive raids on it, they cite this video in particular for it itself, but they do this selective close reading of the video in their actually orders to get the $300,000 terrain. So, and the video, I won't waste your time, but it's worth checking out. There's a moment where, one of the lead character, the person in the balaclava, like throws a Molotov, and then it goes over a fence, but then it lands in a barbecue grill, and somebody like gives a thumbs up with itself. And there's another moment where the activist has like a pair of like bolt cutters and hands it off to somebody else, and the person then starts like trimming the hedges with it itself. So when you read the FBI page, it's like, yes, and they threw a Molotov cocktail in it, no mention of the barbecue pit. They were using these bolt cutters and threatening itself. So it's interesting how the state, right, I like that idea of the structural failure to see, right, things that are actually in this video itself, but would not legitimize them actually preemptively going after people itself. So I think that's a really phenomenal point you mentioned there. And I think many researchers, we always have to think about that when we're critiquing the state or critiquing whatever type of repressive power of what are the counter forces, right, operating there, so we don't, in some ways, implicitly naturalize it. And Mizue, with what you were saying, sort of on the flip side of the state and kind of commercial media, working hand in hand together itself. Often the news, right, the narratives that they tell each other. I think of, again, the RNC 8, where the news was complicit of these lies. You consistently hear, right? I mean, this is the thing. It's such hackneyed narratives that the state employs. Outside agitators are coming. We've heard this with the recent protests. Now, anarchists are there, right? They're lobbing piss and shit, right? There's no evidence of this ever happening itself, but it doesn't matter to the state. And the news eats it up, right? It tends to do itself. So even again, when the RNC 8 was getting ready for its trial about a year in advance, two groups, Twin Cities Indie Media and Glass Bead Collective out of New York City, created this thing called I forget what it's called now, something Dissent. I'm blanking on the name of the video, but nonetheless, the third part is called Here Come the Anarchists, and it was used in support of the RNC 8. That they created their own narrative collectively, right? Essentially saying we're a bunch of kids, these cops came in our place, threatened us, and sort of offered this really eloquent kind of counter-narrative that they were using to mobilize upon when they were going around to raise funds to popularize, right, their resistance to what was going on. And just state recently, Stop Cop City, Defend the Forest going on in Atlanta. So everybody knows roughly about this police compound training facility going on there. What's often forgotten is actually there's a proposed movie studio also set that's going to be on there called Shadowbox Studios itself. They're not affiliated, but I think it's really revealing that these two elements and entities are tied together, right? That the police themselves and also the largest sound studio hasn't been built yet, but nonetheless is being proposed there, that in many ways cements together, right? That union between commercial media, and they feed each other, right? As we say, with shows like 24 and so on and so forth, that valorize repression and our inner Nazi and our inner fascist, right, in many ways that we want to be, and then create the very things that you're talking about, Jack, this wider sense of repression itself. And I'll just end it off here with what you were saying. There's so many things. We can talk about the right wing if people have questions. Because I'm doing work in that, I should say. I'm not going to go into that, but I'm living in Florida, which is a fucking nightmare, which I should just relate. But the good thing is, I'm white and middle-aged, so I can infiltrate right-wing movements very easily. So I've been doing that for the past 2 years of going into Trump rallies and other kind of reactionary rallies to get a sense of like what is going on there. And I'm starting to do some work on conservative media activism in the sense of the ecosystem of what that is and the affect, right, of what that is. And we can go into that. But I wanted to something more positively about like what would it mean to abolish these subjectivities itself. And Arun mentioned this partially too, which is in the book, but I didn't emphasize here, this notion of the diasporic, right, itself. And something I just found really valuable from, if I could mention some older theorists, Paul Gilroy and Stuart Hall from the late 80s and 90s, just brilliant, right, unto themselves. But they were proposing at that time, among others, I should say, but not alone, but this notion of what possibility, and many of you are pinpointing diasporic struggles as the forefront of, right, resistance itself. Not in an idealized way, right, but in some ways in a structural way, that these people are sort of different nations itself, right, not self-identifying. There is a reactionary element of the diasporic, obviously, of like longing for the past, longing for this, feeling lost itself, but there's also an enabling side of this hybridity, right, and sense of coming together with itself. So it's not coincidental that two of my chapters, right, the one on Minneapolis with Muslim American folk and particularly Somali American, and sort of the struggles that are, between East Africa and the United States, and sort of the fluidity of this. And many people I spoke to in Minneapolis, I'm sure maybe you too, Arun, would be like, we are the first to know, like have our phone go bing, something international going on. Like we're really tuned in, both in more structured platform capitalism, but also the Somali net and other ways itself. And similarly, in New York City, that has happened, quite honestly, fall in with these groups of Puerto Rican cop watchers, right? So Puerto Rico, in many ways, being this interesting point for them and their resistance, going from the mainland to Puerto Rico and back, and being influenced. I mean, I should just state the obvious. El Grito, right, is influenced by Puerto Rican struggles, the shout, right? So they emphasize that. Our very name itself is a reference to Puerto Rican struggle, independence, so on and so forth. So I think that's also a potential another way of thinking of new subjectivities forming through diasporic things, right? This is so many ways which makes sense of why the state wants to shut down, quote unquote illegal immigration, shut down all these type of hybridities that challenge these essentialisms that they build on the hierarchy, so on and so forth. Again, I don't want to idealize the diasporic, but there is a potentiality there, I feel, that's very profound, and somewhat the book at least tries to identify some of that. Thank you.
Well, okay. Maybe I'll just start from here and just open it up to the room. There are probably as many cameras and microphones in this room as there are people, but don't let that stop you. There's a lot to dig into. And we probably have maybe 10 to 15 minutes or so that's maybe a good start anyway. Please.
Hi, I'm Jenny. Thank you all for being here. This is so interesting. I wanted to just start by telling Jack that I've been going to... Do I have to start over? I'll just, okay. I've been going to these community police meetings as part of my dissertation, and the one I went to recently talked about the street racing, and I think they may have inadvertently shared some of the joy you were talking about, because they gave out these posters about street racing, and they make it look so sick. And I was, and they definitely were not trying to. But I had this conversation brought up a lot of interesting things about my dissertation, and I know that it's kind of a faux pas to talk about my work, but I am dissertating, so please forgive me. But I study doorbell cameras, like Ring cameras, and the associated sort of apps like Nextdoor, Citizen. And something that's come up in interviews with people who have them is that they really feel that they are using it in a way that is digital media activism, that they're sort of co-opting these cameras. And especially in West Philly, they talk a lot about how they don't want the police there, and they are trying to go back to a time of community policing. And I always ask, like, well, then why not just kind of go back to sitting on the stoop and just being there? And they kind of look at me like I'm stupid. Like, no, this is where we are. Like, we have these cameras. We have to meet this moment at this level. And so I wanted to ask any of the panelists, all of the panelists, how we navigate, I guess, resistance or media activism that has a much more ambivalent, if not just very dubious relationship with state repression, because we know that these cameras are attached to these state adjacent, police adjacent corporations that are, again, at the level of the local, but dictating the global, all of these things that we've talked about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Hi, thank you so much. This question is coming a little bit more, I am a grad student, but this is coming more from like a community member perspective. And something that I was really interested, oh, also, hi, I'm Chris. It was really lovely, your panel and Brooke, it sounds really lovely. One thing that I was thinking about as you were talking was this idea of basically all these thoughts together, but the idea of how the global pressures concentrate on local communities, and where I'm kind of situated as a community member is a lot of work with like Southeast Asian communities and deportation. And so I was curious on when I engage in that work, it is very much from a community like care perspective. Like these are folks who received convictions when they were basically children, and are now navigating as like 50, 40, like 6-year-olds, right, with families. But obviously the United States has a long history of deporting, like using the border as a reinforcement tool against quote unquote, like political leadership in various communities. But I wanted to, and I've seen a lot of, this is a bit of a ramble, I'm so sorry. But I've seen a lot of folks, these folks who are in this like precarious citizenships, precarious like place in the United States, become political voices for their community as they are like learning about maybe their community history, learning about the state violence of the United States, and as they navigate those like border like relationships, maybe separated from their family. I just wanted to, this is a ramble. I wanted to ask your thoughts broadly on what role does the global play now in terms of navigating the tension between deportation and political leadership? That is a long ramble. This is coming more from a community member perspective. So I would love it from the journalists and the academics and the organizers here, yeah.
But I can ask questions. My question was that here, when we're talking about local community, it seems like it's, at least the way I'm seeing it, is like almost like they're all tied together with one kind of mission and are like driven by this motivation. But when I'm thinking of community, let's say from the perspective of India, it just seems like the tensions between community members is quite like is hard to navigate and probably not like very difficult to resolve. And like I'm thinking of, let's say, the caste hierarchy, which is in India, where surveillance even within activism is like there are tensions between community members, and often that tension expresses itself as surveillance. And so I'm trying to understand from you people, what would these tensions or resolving these tensions within a resistance movement look like? Does that make sense? Yeah, and I'm Naina, and I'm a PhD student at Rutgers. Thank you so much.
I definitely want to hear, but because what you're talking about sort of is what I write about with body-worn cameras, right? Which sort of has the same illusion of the illusion that like the police are accountable, right, in this stuff. And I think somewhat what you're getting at, this is just a partial answer. I mean, that's a really complicated question that you're getting at. But as a media scholar, I just can't help the fetishization of technology can't help but feed into this as a panacea. And in some ways that it's inherently liberatory or right, inherently on our side of what it does, where we don't think of deeper things of like even where it's located, right? Like so body-worn cameras, it's problematic on so many levels, though Obama dedicated millions of dollars, right, to enable various police forces. And even certain police forces are resistant of it, which is interesting itself, even though in some ways it makes no difference, right? The literature out there, and I should just say, the study that's often trotted out that says body-worn cameras makes a difference is funded by Axion, one of the founders of body-worn cameras, right? It has a really dubious type of stuff. So, I mean, just two things. People don't often think about these things in more complicated things, and I'm not blaming them, right? I mean, people are busy. It's hard to follow up stuff. I'm an organizer myself, so I would never, again, there's a certain entitlement that I can do this research and stuff, but, one is the positionality of the camera itself, right? So when it's coming from the police officer in terms of body-worn cameras, it tends to, when people watch this, as opposed to a camera looking at the officer, the same actions can be seen much more innocuous from the officer's side than when it's looking at that. There's actually a couple critical lawyers who've done this work in terms of interrogations and where the cameras are located in the room and who seems to be more aggressive and hostile or not, depending on where they're located. And similarly, obviously, is resources, right? You're kind of getting at this thing. Body-worn cameras, first of all, nobody thinks about what you do with the fucking things after the first year of storing the data. All of this stuff is massively expensive. You have to upgrade the equipment. People think it's just a one-time investment, and you have these tiny little police departments investing in it, think it's going to make up all this stuff where it should be involved in resources of school, food, right? Housing, right? All these other ways that things could be employed in of that itself. But in some ways, it's it's an easy answer, which is no answer at all, right? So you get this thing. And Jack was sort of intimating this with these neighborhoods, which are often racist in the ways that they're employing these cameras itself under the auspices of community policing, which sometimes people see as different from regular policing, but it's completely complementary form of it.
So I'll follow up on that because it's related to your question, Jenny, and I think it's related to the last one, what is a community? And it's always this kind of inside-outside, the police since the late 1960s have developed strategically an idea of community policing, which was going to blur that line, which was going to go into communities, not to empower communities to police themselves, but to ensure friendly relationships, right? So whenever community is invoked when it comes to anything related to surveillance or policing, I think primarily of the police model for it, then how do we remove ourselves from that if we're going to invoke community at all? In your case, it sounds like you're also specifically looking at neighborhoods or a neighborhood, right? And specifically domestic technologies, right, of the cameras. So we're getting somewhere with that. Then it brings up, what is a neighbor? What would it mean to also include in that things like, because I forgot to mention this, the ways that surveillance cameras are used in domestic situations for gender-based violence and domestic violence to keep tabs on and control one's partner. So is that part of the conversation too, or is it, or what else might be going on in those moments? So there's no easy divide to say no police, we're just going to do it ourselves. I mean, I believe in we keep us safe, that phrase that keeps coming up, but that we is not a given. It doesn't have a referent. It's a project and a process itself of being made and unmade, which includes different kinds of divisions and conflicts and castes and hierarchies in them. So.
I'll respond to the deportation question. So I think it's a really great example, and I'm glad you brought that into the room, in terms of thinking about the global and the local and what becomes invisibilized, right? So you're talking about people who became refugees due to U.S. imperial wars, who the U.S. is trying to deport to places where they've many times never even lived, right? And I think there's so many things I want to say. One of the things in terms of your point around the U.S. history of policing and bordering, it's important to always remember how this country was founded, right? Through forced removal and then also forced slavery and kind of the legal regimes that exist in terms of bordering are all built on that, right? They're built on genocide and exclusion. But one thing that's really different about now than then it's very important to see it as a continuum. Sorry, let me just step back for 1 second. I think this point around the FBI and the origins being very much around trying to deport people who were seen as a threat to stability, mostly communists and anarchists and labor organizers, and then that moving into kind of a domestic notions of what security and safety meant by targeting people like the Black Panthers and the American Indian movement, and just how you can see these ideas move over time, but there's something really different now, which is the point that we bring up in this little book here, but the other book, Resisting Borders and Technologies of Violence, that we have to understand as kind of like a permanent part of governance at a global scale. And so to your point about the global and the local, one of the things that started happening during Obama times, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the specifics, but I worked a lot with Southeast Asian communities, because these were a lot of the communities where people who were refugees, had criminal convictions, had been here for a long time, and then all of a sudden, their countries for a long time wouldn't actually accept them back as people being deported. And the US then started to put pressure. They had agreements then, right, with like Vietnam and others to open up these countries to receive people back as being deported. And then during Trump, the presidency of 2017 and 2020, they really put a lot of pressure on foreign governments then. If you're going to get funding, if you're going to get trade deals, whatever, you're going to have to receive people back. And I think that this is where it's really so difficult to take, like, it's all about power fundamentally. It's about geopolitical power, right? If you think about asylum law and refugee law, it's very much embedded in who's like seen as a friend of the United States or an enemy of the United States, right? And then you think about the limited legal pathways that exist and who gets to have those. Often it's like business people, like people who have money, right? And then you think about the funding agreements, Mexico, Central America, all tied to, if you're going to keep getting funding from the US, you have to police your border. You have to put that money into police departments, and then you have to share data and cooperate with us. And I think part of what's really challenging here is there's a global economy now that's organized around this whole thing, right? So you got the surveillance industrial complex, military industrial complex. Like, if you look at the market for biometrics and the projected growth, or you look at the market for surveillance technologies and the projected growth, like, that's where the money is, right? Everyone says, like, data is the new gold, right? But it's also, it's about extraction and territory. It's as old as colonialism, right? And I think like this is the challenge where the global and local comes in. I'm trying to think of a wrap-up that's a little bit positive, but that's where Arun will come in.
I don't know if I'll do that, but let me try and say a few words about your question about community, because I think that's, that is a really crucial thing to think about, and you're absolutely right, of course, that if you took a view of any community, as it were, sociologically, you would notice all the fractures along different axes, like caste, like gender, like class, et cetera, right? When you think about, we were talking about earlier about the Somali American community in Minneapolis. Let's pursue that example again. And again, as Chris writes about in his book, the whole point of the CVE, the Countering Violent Extremism policy that he describes in there, is actually to be an intervention precisely in those struggles over who speaks for the community, right? Who defines what this community is, to empower one group that is seen as aligned with the US government's interests, to disempower other groups that are seen as antagonistic to US interests, right? And so these policies actually operate on the assumption that what you were saying is precisely true, right? That there are these fractures. And that's always, I think there is no community except as a terrain of struggle. It's not like a thing in itself, right? So from our point of view, I think it's productive to kind of talk about these fractures that you bring in, but then the next part of the conversation is to say, how do we intervene to, I think there is something politically useful in being able to, for us to say, this is who the community is, right? Even as we understand that, we're putting certain divisions under erasure, right? But still, it's politically powerful to say, this is who the community is. We're going to define who we are, right? And build organization around that story about who we are, right? That's where there's a relationship between potential kinds of radical politics and a notion of identity or community, right? But it requires organization, right? Like they are organizing to do it from their point of view. That's what CV is, an attempt to organize a community in the interest of a system of oppression, right? Maurice Bishop, the leader of the Grenada Revolution, said, organization is our greatest weapon, right? And that's really all we have in the end, but it's also all we need to win. There you go, I did do something a little positive.
Chris, do you want to have the last word?
Not really.
No?
That was brilliant, yeah. I would have said that myself, so thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming out.